Almost a year ago, I got a call from Jim Schiller, and I always take Jim's calls because they're always worthwhile, and he is a great friend, and the more you know him, the more you appreciate him and his leadership here and at the American Zionist Movement and so many other fora, the Jewish Agency, is really remarkable. And he said to me, Malcolm, do you believe in the Constitution? I thought it was strange, and I said, yes. He said, and do you believe in free speech? I said, yes. He said, good, you're giving one. And the next thing I knew, I was getting the Brandeis Award, which is, it really touches me, and your words touch me greatly. You read it almost as I wrote it, so it was quite good. It's a pleasure to be honored with Joe and Debbie Weinberg. I've gotten to know them now twice in less than 10 days, but I know a lot about the family and truly appreciate what they have done. They have transformed Jewish life, and that it's carrying on in the next generation and hopefully in future generations is the real test. And that they are your honorees is a tribute to the BZD, to Randy Eisenberg and to Robert Slatkin, to Brian Sachs, to all of those who helped, Fran, and those who helped make this possible. And also, I'm not going to start naming the people who are here because I know many of you and many are friends. I do have to mention that I have children who are living here and my grandchildren are here, and they're the most important part of all of this. So I thank them for coming. I want to thank one of the great leaders ever to serve the Jewish people, and whom I had the privilege of being a partner with and continue to consider my partner, and someday when we tell the truth of how she stood up to a president of the United States and brought tears to his eyes for something he had done wrong, Shoshana Cardin. Thank you so much for being here. I saw also one of the senior statesmen, Alec Resnick, who was a member of the Conference of Presidents, and extend my condolences to Rita Wertlieb, who is a member of the Conference of Presidents. So we get around. And Howard Friedman said he would pay me if I mentioned his name, so Howard Friedman is here. And also a great friend who has done so much on the national scene, AIPAC, and in the conference. So it's especially fitting for us to come together on Yom Yerushalayim, on Jerusalem Day. Jerusalem is much more than a piece of territory. Jerusalem is a concept. Jerusalem is a belief. Jerusalem shel Mala, Yerushalayim shel Mata, the Jerusalem of heaven and the temporal Jerusalem. The Jerusalem of reality and the sacred Jerusalem. They represent so many things for all of us. Jerusalem is the symbol of unity. Ir shachubra layachdav, the psalmist said. It's the city that unites us, that brings us together. Because whatever other differences we may have, all of us understand the centrality of Jerusalem. And throughout the ages, when there were those who wanted to denigrate us, from the time of the Romans till the Nazis, they used to yell, hep, 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 H-E-P, Jerusalem et perdita, Jerusalem is lost. Because that was a message to the Jews that you're finished, that you have no future, because without Jerusalem, we had no future. So Jerusalem became a symbol. And the miracle of the reunification of Jerusalem and having Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty is something we take for granted too often. That we already accepted. We go to Jerusalem and say, look how beautiful, look at the freedom of religion, look, Muslims, Christians, everybody can go and worship. Look at all the new buildings, look at the high tech, look at all these great things. But how many of us really, in the morning when we get up, say, thank God for the miracles that we witnessed? That Jerusalem represents and symbolizes those miracles and symbolizes our unity, something that is more important now than ever. Because the one precondition for every great thing that happened to the Jewish people was unity. Unity within and unity without. But until you have peace beinechem, as we read in this past week's Torah reading, where it lists the conditions and the benefits that will come by adhering to the commandments, and it tells us that we'll have economic prosperity, security, and the third of the 6 things is peace. And Ibn Ezra says it's not peace alone, it's peace beinechem, shalom beinechem, peace amongst you. Because then all the other things, all the other characteristics and qualities will come true. But where there is no peace, there can be no prosperity, and there can be no security. And too often we overlook, we take for granted. And when we celebrate the holiday of Shavuot next week, it starts, the whole miracle which we celebrate, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, when God gave the 10 Commandments, he only did it after we stood there, Ki'ish Echad B'Lev Echad, as one people in one heart. Meaning that each felt what was in the other's heart. Every man and woman knew what her neighbors cared about, what their needs were. And God said, now you're ready to get the 10 Commandments. It was when we showed this kind of unity throughout our history to the rescue of Russian Jews and Ethiopian Jews and Syrian Jews and Iraqi Jews and Iranian Jews and Yemeni Jews. It was when we put aside the differences that we recognized that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And we were joined by people of every race, religion, and creed, because when they saw the unity of the Jewish people, they understood the importance. They're ready to be with us and to march with us as they did for Soviet Jewry and all of these other causes. But they look first for where we are. So unity is the one condition for all of the great things. The miracle of Purim was when Esther said, Lech Knossos Kol HaYudim, go and gather all of the Jews. She didn't say the Jews of the north, the Jews of the south. She said all of them. And that theme runs through all of Jewish life. The importance of unity represented by Jerusalem. The Saudis announced that they're going to give $1 billion to reshape Jerusalem, meaning to take away its Jewish characteristics. Why is Abbas denying that the temples existed and repudiating both Christian and Jewish beliefs? Why does Khomeini say the Jews never had any ties? The Church of Scotland today said the Jews have no roots in Israel. There was a gathering of 40 countries in Amman under a group called ISESCO, the Islamic Society for blah, 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 blah. And they don't know what it stands for either, so. And you know what the agenda was? The agenda was to declare that the Western Wall was really Al-Buraq's wall, named for the horse of Muhammad who ascended to heaven after he did, even though Muhammad never visited Israel in his lifetime. And that Kever Rachel, Rachel's tomb, which for 3,300 years was never described in a single document of the United Nations, the League of Nations, no Arab document, nothing. In all of their books, it's called Kutab Rachel, Rachel's tomb. Now we find out that it's a mosque named for Muhammad's driver. And that the Marat Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, where all of our forefathers and foremothers are buried, has no connection to the Jewish people. With all that's going on in the Middle East, you think they have something more important to spend their time on? Why this obsession? And today, if you look at United Nations UNESCO documents, it says Western Wall / Al-Buraq's wall. Kever Rachel / mosque in the name of his driver. Khomeini has said Jews never had any roots in the land. All he has to go is to the museum in Tehran and look at the cylinder of Cyrus from the year 350 BCE, which talks about the return of the Jews to their land. He'll probably say that there was a conspiracy of the inscribers at that time that led to this. Why do they care? Why do they want to take it away? What do they gain by denying the reality? A historical reality now uncovered. Every time a shovel goes in the ground in Jerusalem, it only proves more and more the reality. All the new discoveries. When they found the gates where David fought Goliath. To finding the stuff on the Temple Mount, when Arafat tried to desecrate the Temple Mount, that only proved the existence of the temples. Because they understand sometimes better than us that if you take away our past, you take away our future. That if you cut off our roots to the land, then what right do we have to be there? We and all others who don't adhere to the same beliefs that they have. And people tend to dismiss it, to think that it's not important. Believe me, it's very important. It's very important because the secrets of the past are the key to the future. As much as we think we know today, we learn every day more. Even about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, the revelations in the New York Times, through a study that was done 2 weeks ago, which now found 42,000 places that the Nazis built, labor camps, concentration camps, extermination camps, work camps. All of a sudden, 70 years later, we find out that instead of dozens or a couple hundred, 42,000. And last week on NPR, on National Public Television, they had a program, Secrets of the Dead, where they revealed that the British had captured high-ranking Nazi officers. And they put him in a fancy baronial mansion outside of London. But they bugged it. And teams of people were listening to them 24/7, listening to everything that they said. Even the trees were bugged. And in it, these guys revealed the massacre of the Jews. One talks openly how before breakfast their sport was to force Jews to run in the field and they would shoot them down. They talked about the massacre of 75,000 Jews in one city, tens of thousands in other cities, and they talked about it openly. Some expressed revulsion at what they saw. They talked about plans. But the British put it under lock and key and hid it until by chance a researcher recently found it. What were they afraid of? Why didn't they reveal it at the Nuremberg trials? They said they didn't want the Nazis to know that they had this technology, the ability to listen, because the next time maybe they would have to do it again. Were they worried for 70 years? The answer is that it wasn't that they didn't know as they claimed. They didn't want to know, and they didn't want the world to expose the lie that they knew all along. But they didn't do anything. You know, people tell me sometimes that my speeches are depressing. They're not depressing. Because if you know the facts, that's empowering. Ignorance is depressing. You know, the prophets, they say, were prophets of doom. Jeremiah, Isaiah, they weren't. They were prophets of hope. It depends on how you listen to the message. If you only listen to the warning where they say, look, if you guys don't get the message, you better change your behavior. But there will be a glorious day. You will come back. We read this past Saturday that Jeremiah, while sitting in jail, imprisoned by the king because he didn't like his rantings and ravings against the king for his injustices. And he goes and buys a piece of land through his cousin in the suburbs of Jerusalem because he had faith and he knew that ultimately the good would come. The prophets had no power. Kierkegaard said, when a king dies, his power ends. When a prophet dies, his influence only begins. And it continues and grows generation after generation if you listen to the message. The Talmud says, Omer Yerushalayim lo Omar Klum. Somebody who says Jerusalem hasn't said anything. And it used to bother me. What does it mean? And what it means if you simply say next year in Jerusalem at the end of the Seder, or next year in Jerusalem at the end of Yom Kippur davening, but you do nothing in the middle, then you don't really mean it and you haven't said anything. This is a time when all of us have to say something, when all of us will be tested. Truth empowers. Ignorance is what should cause fear. And we have to call things for what they are. Words count. We saw in the Torah this week, Im B'chol Kosai, on 2 letters, the word Im. The whole future of the Jewish people rested. 2 little letters. And many times we read the same thing. When the story of the 10 scouts who were sent, the scouts that were sent by Moses, the 12 scouts, we call them scouts, not spies, because you're too close to Washington, you can't say spies. The difference between the 10 who came back with a negative report and the 2 with the positive report was one word, but. They both saw the same things. They talk about what they'd witnessed. But the 10 said, but there are giants. And the 2 said, and there are giants. I asked an audience of several thousand Christians last week in Los Angeles, who knows the names of the 10 who came back with a negative report? And there was dead silence. I said, who can name the 2 who came back with the positive report? And thousands of people were standing on their chairs yelling, Joshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb. I only wish Jewish audiences gave me 10% of the reaction. And I said, that's the lesson of history. Those who stand with Israel are remembered forever. Those who speak against Israel are written off to history. And it's a lesson all of us have to remember. It doesn't mean you can't criticize Israel. Israel's not Disneyland. Sometimes it's Never Neverland. Israel's not perfect. But it can stand against any measure. And we see the campaigns to delegitimize Israel. But understand, they hit the corporate Jew, the state of Israel, but they mean you. That it's not still politically correct 70 years after the Holocaust to say, I hate Jews. Although increasingly it is, as we see all over Europe. But you can't say, I hate Israel. I hate Zionists. And we see it on our campuses. We see it infiltrating every sector in unions and churches and many others in the entertainment world and the cultural world, where this becomes increasingly acceptable. Martin Luther King once said, we will not be judged by the attacks of our enemies, but by the silence of our friends. It's we who raise the bar. That's what history teaches us. It's not what our enemies do, it's what we do. When Hitler cut off Jews from education, they said, we can live with it. They cut them off from commerce. They said, okay, how much worse? We'll live with it, we'll live with it. Just as the Jews in Egypt, when Pharaoh kept imposing more and more restrictions, said, we can live with it, we can live with it. And when they said finally, no more, then God said, now you're ready to be redeemed. Because first you have to be freed psychologically and mentally before you can be freed physically. And we entrap ourselves and we keep saying, okay, we'll raise the bar, we raise the bar. No, you can't let a cancer spread. And whether it's in our media or whether it's a public official, and when they speak against any group, we have to speak out. And when we see in the Middle East today, thousands of Christians from Nigeria to Indonesia, from Lebanon to Iran, publicly hung from the top of cranes, and the world is silent, shows that they did not learn the lessons of the past. But we did. And we're obligated to speak out. We have to be careful, because if we speak out, then they say, oh, you see, it's a Jewish conspiracy. And it endangers them sometimes more. But frankly, I tell you, I can't sleep at night after I get the reports, and I meet with these Christian groups all the time. I travel to many Arab countries, many that don't have relations with Israel, many that have no connection otherwise. It's horrific that the Copts in Egypt are subjected to this torturous existence. And by the way, when National Geographic decided to do an article finally about the Christians in the Middle East, you notice that all they wrote about was Israel. The one place in the Middle East where the Christian population has increased in the last 40 years and not decreased, and in some cases disappeared. The only place where churches are being built today and the populations grow. And yet we're subjected to this kind of campaign that the media joins in. We see the BBC reporting on the events in Syria. I mean, you can't believe it has any relationship to reality. You notice the Arab countries haven't condemned Israel for what they did. They're applauding it. 100,000 people have been killed. Millions of refugees. And the whole West can't do anything? You have North Korea with this petty dictator, a bug that could be crushed, and he gets away with it? He challenges the West. What do you think the message is to every petty dictator in the world? And it's not a question whether you have pink lines, red lines, orange lines. It's a question of showing will and determination. It's a question of showing strength, because that's all that impresses them. And they believe we're weak. It's what I hear from every Arab leader. The West lacks will and determination. Osama bin Laden said the same thing. Khania of Hamas said the same thing. Our children and grandchildren will pay the price for it. Because the decisions being made these days are decisions for generations, not for years. These are decisions that will affect your grandchildren and their grandchildren. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to really go into all of the issues I wanted to discuss, but I want to talk about two in particular. We're living in an age of rapid transition, rapid change. Change that's breakneck. People can't keep up with all the things that are happening. And it's augmented by globalization, which means that everything today is interrelated. When I came to New York to head the Soviet Jewry organization there, we dealt with the Soviet Union, a huge empire. But he didn't have to think about the ramifications in Indonesia or Nigeria or Iran. Today you have to look at every issue, domestic and international, and see their interrelationship with all the rest that's going on, because today everything is interrelated. And they're far more complex for that reason. And the problem is that we look at it with greater simplicity. We look at it with superficiality. We look at the top line. Our media does not give you a real insight into what is happening. They give you distorted positions. You know, Mark Twain once said, if you don't read a newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read a newspaper, you're ill-informed. Who knew then what we know now, how true that is? That with all the media we have, with all the instant access to cable television, and we see it on the internet even before it happens, everything's available to us. How easy it is even today to distort and misrepresent the reality. And it is in the age of rapid transition, in an age of forgetfulness, people don't have patience for history. It's why you get a distorted picture. It's why Judaism puts the emphasis on history. It's unique to Judaism, because history for us is not about the past, it's about the future. We look back in order to look forward. We look back to learn the lessons of the past, so we spare future generations those trials and tribulations. It is our obligation to the future, because only those who learn the lessons of the past are prepared to meet the challenges of the future. But people don't have time for it. They don't want to spend time studying the history, looking in context, and this is true of our government officials, it's true of our media, it's true of society as a whole. And that's going to lead to failed policies, and it's going to lead to greater prices that will be paid in the future. The world we were promised, the new world order of the 21st century, looks more and more like the world of the 19th century. That the isms we thought were long gone are coming back now in greater and greater virulent forms. You know, they tell the story about a man who's on a scooter, and he drives up to a light next to a guy in a Lamborghini, and it says Doc on his license plate. He says, Doc, that's a beautiful car. He says, yes, it cost me $200,000. He said, that's a beautiful car. How fast does it go? He says, well, in a minute I can get it to 80, in a minute and a half, 120, 2 minutes, almost 200. He said, that's a beautiful car. Can I look inside? He says, sure. And the old man then leans over, crawls around and looks at everything. He said, that's a beautiful car. The doc says, you know, when the light changes, I'm going to show him what this car can do. The light turns green, takes off. He sees the old man left behind at the light, and all of a sudden, the old man passes him. So he puts his foot to the pedal and takes off, sees the old man left behind, and then a minute later, the old man again zooms ahead of him. So he's really getting annoyed, and he puts his foot all the way to the pedal, and he's zooming off, and he looks in the rearview mirror, and there's the old man coming, and he smashes into the back of the Lamborghini. The doc jumps out and runs over, and he said, is there anything I can do for you? He said, yes, could you untie my suspenders from your mirror? I'll wait till it works its way back. And then so many of the things that we thought were left behind in the rearview mirror of history, the isms, racism, anti-Semitism, many others are coming back again. And so we, those who care, have to stand up. We have to be educated. We have to educate our young. We have to reach out across borders, build coalitions, share our experiences, and understand the consequences if we fail to do so. People write today and talk about the Arab Spring. There is no Arab Spring. There never was an Arab Spring. I was in Egypt a week after the revolution there, and twice since then. I met with the young people and the elders. This was never about democracy. Young people want to rid themselves of the burdens of oppression. But this was first and foremost about food and jobs. 40% then, now 50% of the people in Egypt make less than $2 a day. Their economy is in total ruins. Tourism is zero almost. Their foreign reserves have collapsed. Their currency has about a quarter of the value that it had. Bread has gone up several 100%. And if you remember, it started in Tunisia because a guy's cart was taken away. So first and foremost, this is about food and empty stomachs. Secondly, it's about the internet revolution, which enabled people to communicate and get past the censors and the bans and the limitations that government imposed. But it wasn't the cause of it. It's what facilitated it. Third, it's about failed states. Egypt is a real country. It has a real history and identity. That's why the Egyptian army could serve as a unifying force. Syria is not a real country. Syria was put together by colonialists in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Nobody has a Syrian identity. They're Huranis, Druze, Kurds, Christians, Alawites, Sunnis, Shiites, but they're not Syrians. Libya is 147 tribes. Morocco is a real country. Yemen is divided in four by tribal groupings, divided north and south by national identities. You don't read about it, but there you see the proxy war, which is the fourth factor overriding all of this. And that is, all of this is about hegemony in the Middle East. This is the war of the Sunnis and the Shiites of 1,000 years history. That's the core of this battle. And it finds its expression in many ways. But if you go to the core of what's happening in each of these countries, you will find that it's a battle for the future. We look at the case of Syria. You know, people present the case in Syria that it was the rebels against the regime. It's not the rebels against the regime. There's layer upon layer upon layer in Syria. It's Russia versus the United States. It's capitalists versus the non-capitalists. It's the people who want to bring change versus the jihadists. And between the jihadists, the Sunnis and the Shiites, and between those who backed by Qatar versus those backed by Saudi Arabia, it's about Tehran versus Istanbul. And many others. I met Assad 2 months before the fighting broke out there in Damascus and spent 3 hours with him. And one of the things he told me was that if it ever happens in Syria, what happened in Egypt to Mubarak, he said, I will never leave. Because I will get out, but they will massacre the Alawites. And he's right. But understanding that, we should have taken the right steps then, as we suggested. But unfortunately, we wait. And we send the wrong signals. And we allow forces like al-Nusra, which today is becoming a dominant player in the rebellion. I may meet the opposition from Syria. I was in Paris. I met them hour after hour, each group. But they have no relevance to the fight, all those guys who are fighting on the front lines inside the country. And they're backed, some by Saudi Arabia, some by Qatar, some by others. And they represent ideologies, and you see increasingly how Iran is supporting groups going in. Today they announced that they're training 150,000 guys by Hezbollah and Iran to go in and bringing Shiites from as far away as Pakistan to take over. Thousands of Hezbollah guys are fighting there now. Iran and Russia are supplying the weapons. This is not going to end very quickly. When you have 1 million refugees, millions of refugees destabilizing countries like Jordan or Turkey, and nobody knows what will happen the day after. You have to put things into context. We have to understand the history. We have to understand the relevance of each of these issues. And nowhere is it more relevant than this, because what happens there is not going to be confined to the Middle East. This is a battle for 4 empires. You have the Turks who are trying to recreate the Ottoman Empire. Erdogan says it. He's doing it. Go and ask Muslim leaders in Central Asia about the pressure they're getting from Turkey, about the infiltration. And he wants to go from Turkey through Syria to Western Iraq to Jordan to the Gulf and create the Sunni Crescent. The Iranians want to create the Persian Empire and go through Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas to the Gulf. And this is not local. I was in Sarajevo recently, and in Srpska, and the president of Srpska said to me, "Did you see the embassy?" And I said, "No." The Iranian embassy in a country of 3.5 million people has 450 people working there. So I went to check it out before I came back, before I said anything, and I was told, yes, it's true there are 450 people, but there's also 200 more Iranians working in an educational center next door, because it's a base of operation to the Caucasus, in the Balkans, in Central Asia. And these Muslim countries are turning to the West and saying, what are you doing for us? What's the message? And the longer Iran gets away with it, the more that they will live in fear. Because the terrorism that Iran spreads around the world, and it's not just attacking us from 8,000 miles away. Listen, read the testimony of the head of the FBI to the Congress of the United States about Mexico, about Hezbollah's presence, digging tunnels like they did in Gaza under our border. They're fighting us from an hour off our coast in South America, in Bolivia, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Venezuela. This is a global effort. That's the consequence of this, why you have to take it seriously. And I don't want a war with Iran. I don't think we need a war with Iran. We abandoned the people of Iran when the Green Revolution went into the streets in hundreds of thousands, and our officials said, we don't get involved in family feuds. And they said, we're alone. And this is true of Republicans and Democrats. It's not a partisan issue. It's that we react, we don't anticipate. And this world can't afford that. You can't live that way when you're facing enemies who have very clear visions of what they want. And all you have to do is listen to them. Khamenei tells you exactly what he's going to do. Erdogan tells you what he's going to do. The jihadists tell us exactly what they're going to do, and that when they finish with Assad, they said this week, we go to Jordan and then Israel. Now, if you think about what I told you with my hypothetical map, where Syria comes down, where Turkey comes down, where the Wahhabis go from Saudi Arabia, and the fourth empire is the Muslim Brotherhood. And they have built an empire, winning every election from Cairo to Morocco. But they're all over the Middle East, and especially in Syria today, in Jordan, where they threaten the future of King Abdullah. And if you think of the map, you'll realize that there's one little thing blocking them. One little soul democracy, hardly a speck on the land amongst all of these countries, that is the brake on their aspirations. So Arab leaders say to me today, our only hope is Israel. We'll condemn them, but their only hope. It's their hope against Iran. It's their hope against the jihadists. During the war in Gaza, they were calling us and saying, tell them, decimate Hamas. It's what will save all of us. And Israel acts with such precision and care. When they attacked Gaza, they flew 1,000 sorties. Less than 100 people, and most of them terrorists, were killed. Bombing places because Hamas purposely put their rockets inside civilian populations to draw the fire on civilians. And the Israelis acted with great intelligence, great care, and put themselves at risk not to hit civilians. And the UN came out immediately with a condemnation, and the whole world ran on front page, Israel guilty of war crimes, until last week, when the UN study showed that in fact Israel exercised extreme caution, unprecedented caution. That didn't make the front page of the papers. And despite the information revolution, the truth is you can't believe what you read, you can't believe what you hear, you can't even believe what you see. All of you saw pictures during the war in Gaza of a father carrying a 7-year-old. It was the front page of the New York Times, and I'm sure the Baltimore papers and everywhere else, carrying a picture released by the United Nations office in Gaza, a 7-year-old girl, bloodied, said killed by the Israel Air Force. And the Israeli Air Force said, we didn't even fly planes. And it turns out that she had been killed 7 years earlier in an automobile accident. That the pictures of children shown every day were in fact killed in Syria. And they transposed the pictures. That in Reuters, they had to remove 900 pictures from their files from the war in Lebanon because they had a stringer there who painted in Israeli planes bombing civilian populations when none of it was true. So even what you see and think is the truth ain't the truth. And it's especially true when it comes to Israel, how much distortion, how much misrepresentation. Doesn't mean, again, that you can't have differences with some policy or something that Israel does. But Israel's record can stand, I think, against anyone, any other country, including our own. Two allies who share so much. And we see, everybody says, President Obama, the fact is the United States and Israel have unprecedented cooperation in military security and the other areas. That his visit to Israel showed again the nature of the relationship. And every president, President Bush II, President Bush I, even President Reagan, all of them go through this period Where they put pressure on Israel because it's the only one you can pressure. You can only pressure your friends. They pressure the Arabs, they're not going to do anything. Until they realize that we have one ally, as Vice President Biden told us last week, it's America's aircraft carrier in the Middle East. It's much more than that. It's the model. Go to Africa today, as I did, and all of them say, give us Israel, forget Europe and America. The agriculture, the high tech, the scientific developments, the medical developments, it's what they need. I took the central bankers of 6 African countries to Israel. They were like kids in a candy shop. They couldn't get enough of it. Don't dismiss these distortions. Don't dismiss the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. These things have real consequences. When we don't pay attention, we pay a heavy price in the future. I know the message isn't great to hear, but the truth is that we have so many things to celebrate. We have Jerusalem, we have Israel. Think of it, that Israel remains despite all the overwhelming odds. Think of all the kibbutz goliaths, the prophetic vision of the ingathering of the exiles that's taken place in your lifetime. Miracle after miracle, that they call it the startup nation. Ask anybody, any of your neighbors, how big Israel is. They'll tell you it's a little smaller than China. Israel's a statistical error in the census in China. We have great friends around the world. We have great opportunities. And it's time for us to stand up proudly and to speak out. This is not about 67. This is not about occupation or non-occupation. This is about 47. It's about Israel's right to exist. It's the right of the Jewish people to national expression. It's the right of Jews to be able to defend their own citizens and to control their own fates. That's why Jerusalem is so important, because it is the symbol of our eternity. It's where Christians, Muslims, Jews, and people of every other faith can come and look to that place for inspiration. It's because we are sure of the protection and the future of that holy place. You know, Warren Buffett, when he came recently to the Middle East, he said, if you're looking for oil and gas, skip Israel. If you're looking for integrity, creativity, incentive, it's your only stop. He was wrong, because now they have oil and gas. I think they're old cholent deposits, but we'll have to see when they really come to it. Will and determination. You know, God has done great miracles for us. The question is, what do we do to show that we're worthy of them? You know, when Noah built the ark, he knew that those planks couldn't hold the elephants and everything. It was a miracle. So if he already had the miracle, why didn't God build a whole ark? Would he have to schlep Noah out? The answer is that God wants us to do our part. Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, only took place when Nachshon put his foot in this water. He didn't split the sea. And God said, you have to show. You have to have that leap of faith. You have to show the commitment that you care, that you've learned the lessons of the past, that you understand your responsibility. Not everybody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Each of you influences so many people. We did a study that showed that 55% of the American people have a Jewish friend, relative, or business associate. And they said that those who mention Israel, talking about Israel, the pro-Israel numbers go up 300%. But 75% of them said they never talked to us about Israel. Each of us first has to educate ourselves, educate our children, reach in, reach out. We have this week the Stars of Scandal. I have no idea what it is, but I know they're in Israel and we're paying for it. The Stars of Twilight, which I did hear about, but I don't know what it is. And we sent the cast of House MD because these people come back and say it's 180 degrees different than we expected. When you ask them, you heard, what do you think Israel's an apartheid state? They say yes. 50% of the Americans, and all of a sudden they find out it's the exact opposite. And it's not militaristic. You walk the streets, you go to bars, you can do everything. It's a free country. But you see how far the mistaken images have infiltrated our society, but also in our community. When they didn't want to call Boston an act of terror, it was a huge mistake. Not because it changes things, but because words count. And you have to call it for what it is. Terror is called terror because it seeks to destroy and instill fear. It's what racists and bigots do. They try to intimidate into silence. We have to show we will never succumb to that. That it's a time when people have to rally together. When we have to show and be proud of the term Zionist and to say proudly, we are all Zionists. time to remind everyone that never again is a sacred pledge that every generation has to take anew, Jew and non-Jew alike. That this is a pledge to future generations, that we will not be silent, not when our own suffer, not when others suffer. Our generation is different than the generation of 70 years ago because that was a generation of tsaros, of terrible pain and suffering. Ours is a generation of miracles. God has performed great miracles for us in our time as in those days. And our job is to prove ourselves worthy, to educate the next generation and to learn from the previous generation, to show that we understand the nature of the challenges, that we will reach out to our elected officials, to the media, that we will try to educate all of those that we can. The American people are with us in overwhelming numbers, but they're looking to us to lead. And this is the time, as we come to Shavuot, as we finish this intensive period from Passover to Shavuot, where this one theme of Zechirah, remembrance, is the core. Even for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Memorial Day, the word chosen to symbolize it wasn't avenge or revenge. It was Zachor, remember. Because remembrance keeps their presence alive. It reminds us of the lessons of the Shoah, not just about their deaths, but also about their lives. It reminds us of our obligation today to make sure that never again is a sacred pledge that we live up to, and we live up to that responsibility. And if, in fact, we have learned the lessons of the past, and we understand our responsibilities to the future, then our children and our grandchildren will look back and they will praise you and they will thank you for making it a better world for them.